we originally started working on images of domestic violence victims, and then we got drawn into autopsies and imagery that comes out of autopsies. So in fact, we're not going to talk about photographs of injuries, we're going to talk about dead people. So if that bugs anybody, and I'm talking dead people in pretty horrible context, so if that bugs you, just FYI, that's what we're talking about. So what we have become interested in is forensic medicine, and the autopsy suite in particular, which builds on an array of medical imaging technology and offers pathologists an array of different options to consider when they're both investigating and also presenting evidence to court in a murder trial. What constitutes a good autopsy is a contested area, as is anything else, but essentially rests on a balance of probative value versus maintaining the dignity of the body. And what we're interested in is how the knowledge that is acquired of the body in the deep dive of medical exploration that you see in the autopsy suite when an autopsy is actually performed, how that makes it to court and how it gets presented in court. And in particular, we're focusing on two murder cases. So the first is Cindy Gladue, who was killed in 2011, an indigenous Cree woman, 33 years old, found dead in a bathtub in a hotel. And then Donna Jones, who died in 2013 of sepsis as a result of burns sustained from her partner. She was left to die for 11 days in her basement. These two cases we feel are very important to look at side by side because their murders are so close together. As we'll talk about in a minute, the legal questions that are presented in their murders are also very, very similar, but the ways their bodies are treated are diametrically opposed. So we see Gladue's body being treated savagely, and we recognize this as certainly an affect of colonization, and we'll talk more about that when we get into the details of the autopsy of Cindy Gladue, as compared to Donna Jones's body, which is treated very preciously, to the extent that, and we just did an interview with the pathologist who autopsied Cindy Gladue, or sorry, Donna Jones, and he was very emphatic with us that he did not want to make any more cuts than absolutely necessary on her body, and what he did instead was use both X-ray, CT, and MRI technologies in order to show the history of injuries on Jones's body that would have otherwise been invisible unless she had been literally cut open. So that's our starting point.
So before Dawn goes into some of the specifics of these cases and the various visual techniques that were used to show the court and the jury the injuries and tell the stories of the injuries of Donna Jones and Cindy Gladue, I'm just going to say a little bit about the role of the forensic pathologist in a murder trial, some of the standardized procedures and forms that pathologists use when conducting all autopsies, because this is a bureaucratized process, and then just some of the various factors that come into play when pathologists make decisions about how to visually represent fatal injuries and their sources to the courts. So again, these are very preliminary insights, and clearly pathologists do have their own discretion when they make decisions about what to present and how to tell the story of an injury. But there are still specific institutional standards and guidelines and mandates that they have to follow. So one interesting aspect, an important aspect to keep in mind about the forensic pathologists is that they only a tiny percentage of the bodies that they investigate and the deaths that they investigate end up being murder victims, right? So most of the autopsies that they do are for the purpose of diagnosing death for the objective of public health, right? So really their role in investigating death is a biopolitical one. But what we find interesting here is that this is more of a necropolitical role. And some of the forms that they use, they have two standardized forms that they use. when conducting their autopsies. And again, all bodies are subject to these forms. The first is a general report of the post-mortem examination. And this is a 10-page comprehensive report, and it documents the pre-autopsy history, so they get information about the scene that they document, but then they also document the external examination, descriptions of the injuries, there's a toxicology report, and then they also indicate what they find through an internal examination, and then what tissues and organs they retained. And in addition to that, they also have a series of body maps. So they often use these maps, and as you can see, they're standardized. These are all government documents. And these are the maps that they use to indicate the injuries when they perform the external autopsy.
Yeah,
do we have that? Okay, and then there's the skeleton, and presumably
that's
broken
the
bones.
internal, yeah.
Broken bones, and then when they perform autopsies, they have to cut into the ribs and open up the chest cavity. So that's a way for them to indicate some internal injuries. Okay. And so these are the initial forms. And again, a lot of this is to document, but all of this, these body maps and the reports, they're all admissible in court and can be introduced as evidence. So clearly the pathologist has access to these reports, but there are also a variety of other forms of visual evidence, particularly photographs of injuries are used to present evidence of injury and death to the jury and the court. And so we're finding from speaking, from our preliminary conversations with pathologists, that a number of factors go into play when they make decisions about how to represent injury in court. And one factor that's particularly important, well, we're still trying to figure out the degree to which it's important, but this is what the pathologist who worked on the case involving Donna Jones told us, was that they have to maintain the dignity of the body. Okay? And this ethic dictates the degree to which a corpse can be tampered with for the purposes of producing and presenting visual evidence of murder in court. A symbolic gesture of respect for the deceased, this imperative applies to all corpses consistently and objectively, regardless of who these individuals once were, and no matter how central this quest is of finding justice for the victim. And of course, at least that's supposed to be how it happens in theory. But Don will expand on this.
But it's not what happens in practice, as it turns out. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about Donna Jones, and then I'll tell you about Singh and Moore. So Donna Jones died 11 days after sustaining third-degree burns to 50% of her body. She died of sepsis. During that time, she was also shot with a pellet gun, and her nose was broken. This was coming out of an 8-year relationship, which witnesses who were called to testify at Donna Jones's murder trial gave example after example of the expanding trauma bond between Donna Jones and Mark Hutt, absences from work, pulling back from friends, all of the things with which we're all familiar with. But the problem from a probative perspective was that they couldn't show a trauma bond in a dead person is not evident in the hearsay evidence that's given by witnesses, right? So they went back to Jones's body. Now, Christopher Milroy, who was the pathologist who performed Jones's autopsy, had been tipped off by the police that there were likely pellet guns embedded in Jones's body. Instead of performing a full autopsy, so a normal autopsy, you'd be sliced from here to here, your ribs would be cracked open, all your organs are taken out and so on. But usually limbs are not touched, and then your head is opened up and your brain is looked at as well. What they did with Jones was instead of performing further cuts to her body, they imaged her. And they used x-rays and MRIs and CTs to show the history of traumatic injuries to her body. So, and what they did in court then was to present, sorry, we're doing a little dance here, was to present a CGI animation using a body map. So I don't have the animation with me, but it went a little bit like this. Injury number 1 was here to Donna Jones's head. A red spot appears. Injury number 2 was here to Donna Jones's wrist. Another red spot appears. And so on, and it builds in order to show the physicality of this psychological condition called a trauma bond, right? And that was vital to the case because Jones did not die directly as a result of Hutt's actions. She died of sepsis, right? You can't make somebody have sepsis. So Hutt's argument was that, yeah, he was a monster, but this was negligence at best. The Crown wanted first degree, and this was how they went after it, was to say, no, her body shows a history of trauma. Her body shows a history of abuse. When we interviewed Milroy, he was adamant that because of the gruesomeness of Jones's life, and I've seen the crime scene photographs, they are pretty gruesome, he was not going to reinvent that violence in her death. And so he was going to do everything he could to maintain, as Rashmee said, the integrity of her body. Now, we contrast that with Cindy Gladue, who's found she bleeds out in a bathtub. It's a wound to her vagina. Cindy Gladue is a known sex trade worker. She's a Cree woman. She's a mother of 2. Not a single person at Cindy Gladue's trial testifies. There's not a witness called who knew Cindy Gladue before the immediate hours preceding her death, including her partner who went looking for her because he was worried that something had happened to her. So Cindy Gladue never comes to life in the courtroom, in contrast to Donna Jones, who's described as this blue-eyed, bubbly, fun, responsible, hardworking, girl next door type. 2 things that become most concerning about Cindy Gladue's body is that instead of moving toward medical imaging in order to maintain the dignity of the flesh, the pathologist in Gladue's case, Dr. Dowling, elects to sever her vagina from the rest of her body, because that's where the wound is, and he preserves it for 2.5 years in what's akin to an ice cream bucket that is kept in an unlocked cupboard somewhere in the pathology unit. He visits it from time to time. He brings other people to see it. Wait, it gets worse. Then they bring it into the courtroom, not at preliminary, at trial, and there's a voir dire about the admissibility. Is this probative or prejudicial? What we found most striking about the voir dire was that it was absolutely taken for granted that Cindy Gladue's vagina should sit on the evidence table with a piece of cloth covering it and just sit there. Not the judge, none of the lawyers questioned its presence in the courtroom. When it came down to actually looking at it as a piece of evidence, the Crown requests that the judge and the defense lawyer all gather around the evidence table. The pathologist, Dr. Dowling, literally unveils her vagina, puts on gloves, starts showing it to the lawyers and the judge. And then most disturbing to us is that there's a question about a dangling piece of flesh coming from the wound. And this is all a question of whether or not she was stabbed or whether this was a fisting injury from rough sex. So there's this question of this dangling piece of flesh, and as the defense counsel is asking Dr. Dowling about the dangling piece of flesh, Dowling says to him, well, do you want to put on a glove? And Bados, the defense counsel, says, sure. And he actually fingers her vagina in the courtroom. And nobody says anything about it. And then this same evidence then gets presented in front of the jury. It's put on the evidence table, and then they have a live feed video camera that puts it up on a screen very much like this one. So our question is, we have 2 women killed within 2 years of each other, very similar circumstances. In both cases, you cannot prove the immediate act of murder because both women took a while to die. And the defense in Cindy Gladue's murder was to say this actually was fisting, it was consensual, And her vaginal wall was compromised largely because she was promiscuous and she was drinking. And that compromised the integrity of the tissues of her vaginal wall, therefore her vaginal wall was perforated and she bled out. So we see these two women as giving us a red flag in terms of how the body as it is understood in life as a person, or in Gladio's case, a non-person, then dictates the kinds of medical intervention that we see in the autopsy suite, and then how that then carries forward to the decisions that are made about the evidence that gets presented at trial.
And so we're going to conclude there because I know we're a couple of minutes over, but we just have the methodological question that we're really struggling with when we try to make sense of this is, because we're trying to make sense around decision making, is what were the specifics of, what were the specific conversations between the pathologist and the prosecutor in terms of why they thought why this should happen? Why should Gladio's vaginal tissues be presented to the court? We know the obvious argument about presenting information about the injury, but it wasn't in the preliminary hearing. And that, I think, is the conundrum here. So as we go along, this is one of the questions that we're going to grapple with. Thank you.